Bear in mind, this was late 2009, and I was only 10 at the time. Me, my mother and stepdad lived in a small town in Sweden in a big house. If you were upstairs, you could still hear talking down at the kitchen, so it wasn't that isolated. One evening when I was home alone because my mum and stepdad was going to my grandma's house, and I asked them if I could stay home alone because I was a typical 10-year-old and thought I was too grown up for a babysitter. After about an hour of nagging, she gave up and told me I could stay home alone, only if I kept the door locked and never opened it to anyone. It was really exciting for me, and I stayed up really late watching cartoons. If I remember correctly, I was watching SpongeBob in our living room and eating ice cream. After about 5 minutes of eating the delicious ice cream, I'm sure I heard a silent knock on the door. I didn't think much of it and continued watching the show. Another 5 minutes passed and I heard the knocking again, but this time it was much louder. I was frozen in fear and waited for the knocking to stop. After about 30 seconds, the knocking stopped and the only sound was the TV. I called my mum and she said that she'd be home in 20 minutes, and she told me to go into my room and lock the door. I went into my room without turning the TV sound off, so it was pretty loud. I sat in my room and after 2 minutes I heard somebody not knocking, but banging really loud at the door. I was frozen in fear once again. After about 3 minutes I could hear the door lock turn and somebody walking in. The person was inside my house while I was home alone. I sat there in my room, quiet, and then the TV turned off. The footsteps were louder and it felt like it was coming towards my room. After a couple of seconds, the steps stopped and I could hear knocking on my bedroom door, and an old man said, "Let me in. I have something for you." I started screaming and crying for my mother, and the man started shaking the door handle. After 2 minutes, I heard a car outside, so I looked out the window. It was my mum. I opened the window and screamed for help, and said that there's a man in my home. My stepdad quickly ran to the shed to get his axe and ran up the stairs. The man quickly ran out the back door and my stepdad ran after him into the streets. My mum called the police and my stepdad calmed me down when he got in. This is an experience I will never forget.
This encounter happened to me a while ago. For some background, I live in the country in Ohio, down a long drive, fields on 2 sides and woods in the back. I'm about a mile away from town, so if I need to call the police, I have to call the sheriff. I live with my husband and Boxer. The night this happened, my husband was getting some overtime at his factory. It was a Saturday and he was working 3rd shift. I had spent the evening at my parents' house and didn't head home until around midnight. I stopped in town at our 24-hour gas station to get some drinks, chocolate, and beef jerky for my dog, Alzy. As I exit the gas station, I get this strong feeling of being watched. I just look around because I knew someone was outside with me. Over to my left, about 20 feet away, is a girl in a really cute dress with a white horse mask on, just standing there. We stared at each other for a minute before I hopped into my car and quickly pulled out onto the road, almost hitting a light pole as I belatedly checked my back seat for danger. That was unnerving, but I was home just a few minutes later giving Alzy jerky, eating chocolate, and watching TV. All of a sudden, my dog takes off down the hall to the back porch, barking and growling, attacking the window. I run in there, afraid the window was going to get broken again, and I stopped dead in my tracks. There, standing at the window, was the same girl wearing that horse mask. Again, we stared at each other. I looked over to the back door. Was it locked? Shit, I couldn't remember. The girl in the mask looks over at the door. Slowly, I walked over to it, So does she. We both reach for the knob. It was locked. The girl looks behind her, and for the first time I look around my backyard. There's a guy in a horse mask too. Freaked out and scared shitless, I decided to call the cops. I got Alzy and shut the door to the porch and went to the living room to get my cell phone. Of course, I left my cell phone in the car when I carried my stuff in the house. My car that's in my garage, my dark garage. Basically lacking any choice, I opened the door to the garage and tried to open my car door, but it was locked. I must have locked it and didn't have the keys. I crept back into the house, no sign of Alzy, no horse mask in the backyard that I could see from the kitchen window. I grabbed my keys and got the phone. I called the sheriff and told them what happened. They asked if they were still outside. I looked out of the windows room by room. Nothing. Until I got to my front yard. Right out front, there they were, just standing about 100 feet away holding hands, staring. I honestly was crying at this point to the dispatcher who assured me someone would be there soon. As I stood there, clearly on the phone, the girl waved. Then they walked hand in hand down my lane out of sight. It took the sheriff 10 minutes to get here. They found nothing. Told me the guy probably sat in a car and they followed me. Just kids being kids, they said. My dog didn't come out of my bedroom the rest of the night. I sat up listening to silence until my husband got home. A couple of weeks later, the sheriff stopped by to follow up. They said they checked the cameras at the gas station, but all it shows is the girl walking up to the dumpsters and stood there until I left and she walked away.
This happened to myself and a close friend, both 23-year-old males, just last month. We decided to go on a 2 nights backpacking camping trip in the Adirondack Mountains of New York. We were both very comfortable with nature and spent a lot of time camping, hunting, fishing, etc. We hiked for about 5 miles into a small lake and set up camp on a small beach. This was not a heavily trafficked area and we did not expect to run into anyone. Our first night there, as we were sitting around the fire, we saw a flashlight moving on the other side of the lake at around 10:30 PM. This was fairly unusual, however, we did not think too much of it. But as time went on, this flashlight kept moving around the lake, getting closer to our campsite. We kept discussing who could possibly be wandering in the woods in the middle of the night, and we did not particularly want an unwelcome guest. Once it was clear that the person or people were heading for our campsite, we moved off into the woods nearby to see who wandered up. I took a small axe with me, and he had a .22 rifle. Now, we weren't expecting trouble, and we certainly didn't want to make any, but we figured we might as well cover our bases. The flashlight comes near the light of our fire, and it's one man. He has a beard and is probably in his mid-40s. The scary part was that he was carrying what turned out to be a pump-action shotgun. He walked around the campsite a few times, and then proceeded to enter our tent. After rummaging around for a minute or so, he came out and started yelling,
"I know you're out there. Why don't you come out and say hello?"
My friend and I remained motionless under a hemlock tree about 50 yards away. This is when the man proceeded to fire his shotgun into the woods, not too far from where we were. He also swung his flashlight around several times. After what felt like hours, he grabbed my friend's backpack and a few articles of clothing we had drying off near the fire and threw them in to burn. My friend, who had aimed a .22 at the man, asked me if he should shoot. I told him absolutely not, unless he spots us and starts to point the gun in our direction. Thankfully, the man had moved towards where he had come from after a little while. We waited until his flashlight was on the other side of the lake, ran out, grabbed everything we could fit in my backpack, and took off. It was now around 2 or 3 AM. We ran out of the trailer with flashlights and made it back to my car as the sun was coming up. We immediately went to the police department and reported it. We also spoke with some forest rangers. That was it. I haven't heard anything back from the police, and it wasn't mysterious, however, it did creep the hell out of both of us.
This isn't a made-up story. It genuinely happened and was actually featured in my local paper. But I don't like the idea of people knowing who I am or finding me, so I won't link it. I'll try to keep this as short as I can while giving most of the details. A little background for context first of all. I'm a female and was 23 at the time of the incident. I was living in the house my parents left me after they died. My dad died when I was 5 from a stomach ulcer, and my mum died of womb cancer when I was 22. I'm an only child with no grandparents or other family, and so, as you can imagine, it was pretty devastating to lose my mother, and I wasn't ready to sell her home, my childhood home, just yet. So I was living there alone at the time. The way the house was situated was pretty perfect for any criminal behaviour, I guess, because although it wasn't isolated, neighbours a stone's throw away on both sides, it was surrounded by very tall trees at the front and backed onto a forest. So anyway, on with what happened. The first odd thing, that didn't seem odd at the time, was that someone was ringing the doorbell a lot very early in the morning that day. At first, I ignored it because I was still grieving and depressed, so didn't really care about the outside world at that time. Anyway, the person seemed to leave after 5 or 6 rings, and I fell back to sleep. Cut to the afternoon. The doorbell rings again, and this time I can't ignore it, because the man outside could see me through the blurry glass door in my hallway. So I answer, and this homeless-looking man with a huge backpack on the ground starts asking me about my home. He obviously wasn't part of any company, so thinking he's an oddball trying to see how easy it would be to rob my house, I politely say I'm not interested and close the door. He stands there for ages, but I see him eventually leave and I brush it off. 20 minutes later he's back. Thank God I locked my door, because I see him walk straight up to the door and start trying to open it. I shout through the glass at him and he looks shocked and says he knew my mother. I just ignore him and call the police straight away after checking all the doors and windows were locked. While I'm still on the phone, I hear him using what sounds like tools, and getting scared he's about to break through the door, I stand by my back door ready to run. About 30 seconds later, I see my front door shutter and slightly open. I panic, drop the home phone, smart, I know, and run as fast as I can down my garden into the woods, onto the path and run to a neighbouring street. I don't see him anywhere, so I assume he's robbing my home, and that's all he wanted. Slightly relieved, I knock on a stranger's door at random and ask them to call the police again. The police arrived to meet me in the living room of this stranger, what seems like hours later, but was probably only 40 minutes. I go to the police station and find out exactly what happened was a lot creepier than I had imagined. When the police got to my home, the man was gone, but he left a host of fingerprints and evidence, and because he was known to the police, he was picked up the next day hiding in a family campsite. He wasn't too bright obviously, and also had a long list of mental health problems, everything from schizophrenia to manic depressive. He used a long screw-like tool to break my door lock by hammering it through, and once inside he left huge carving knife marks all along the hallway, as well as muddy handprints and creepy carved out words on all 4 of the bedroom doors, which were almost all spelled incorrectly, like the word bitch, as well as the phrase got you. It might not sound like much, but I can't explain just how scary it is to see slice marks, metre-long covering your hallway. He also left a large knife stabbed into one of my bedroom doors, fingerprints and all. He didn't steal anything as far as I'm aware, but he had actually left a note for me that morning when I hadn't answered my door. although I never saw it because it was under a plant pot. His spelling was atrocious, so it was hard to even fully understand what the note said, but he proved he knew my full name, age, and that I lived alone. Frustratingly, I wish I could say he went to prison for a long time, but in the end, I think he only got around 3 years, even though he was wanted for other petty crimes, and a more serious case of rape. I've never seen him again, and since sold my old family home, but I still can't bring myself to answer the door to strangers to this day.
Shortly after graduating high school, a group of friends and I decided to go camping one weekend. We drove to a national park that had a camping ground, but we chose to camp outside the ground so we didn't have too much interaction with the other campers. We set up camp in a nice clearing next to a heavily wooded slope. As the night drew in and the moon was full of light, we had a fire crackling, some cold beers, and everything was going as planned. At around 10 p.m., we heard the sounds of people approaching our campsite. At this point, our guards were up, but we weren't too concerned. We figured it was the other campers that were setting up nearby. After all, the national park is quite popular. We kept our eyes and ears in tune to the sounds in the distance. Soon enough, the group of strangers arrive at the bottom of the slope, stopping before the tree line met the clearing. It was difficult to see who these people were since it was after dark. 6 figures in total, all huddled together, standing eerily still under the moonlight. The reflected light shone on their white clothes, making their appearance even more unsettling. I sensed my friends were just as uneasy as I was. To ease the tension, my friend Deacon calls out to the group in a friendly tone. "Hey, how's it going?" They say nothing. My friend calls out to them again and says, "We're just enjoying this beautiful night with some beers. What are you guys up to?" Not a single response. Eventually, a man emerges from the tree line and walks towards us. He stops just before the light of our campfire and stands there looking down at us. Deacon babbles nervously, but the man cut him off mid-sentence.
"How long will you be staying here?"
The man says in a low, slurred tone of voice. From the looks of it, this guy was not friendly. We originally planned to stay for 2 nights. I think our visit has been shortened for obvious reasons. I blurt out, "We aren't planning to stay long. By tomorrow morning, we will be gone." My friends muttered in agreement. The man says nothing, just standing looking down at them. Now that he was in a better range of focus, I noticed more details about his clothes. As mentioned before, his clothes were all white. The shirt hung loosely over his torso. It looked like a jersey made out of thin cotton-like material. It was strange how he wasn't freezing wearing that thin shirt. That night was so cold you could see your own breath. The man orders us to leave first thing tomorrow morning. We all agree, panicky. The man seemed satisfied and retreats back to his group. As soon as the group went out of hearing, we began to talk nervously amongst ourselves. How creepy and scary those people were. We were so nervous we couldn't even finish our night of drinking and fun. The whole time it felt like we were being watched. Did the group of creeps really disappear into the woodland slope, or were they still lingering into the night preying on us? The next morning we loaded the car and hit the road. We finally got a sense of relief as we headed home. My friends and I discussed amongst ourselves who those creeps were. Since we were safe from harm's way, we joked about it. We made a stop at the first patrol station in a town near the park to pick up some snacks. The man at the counter seemed friendly, so we engaged in small talk. We mentioned what happened to us last night at the campsite. He seemed interested to know more, so we explained our encounter with the figures in white. We expected him to laugh about it, but all he did was give a grave expression on his face and said, "You kids are very lucky you made it out alive." And that is the scariest part of the story. We paid for our snacks and left for the city, never to return again.
There had been discussion about going to the Dead Sea, located in the West Bank. I had researched it heavily, posting on Lonely Planet and travel advisor forums about safety. Being budget backpackers, we were advised online to grab a tent and camp right on the sea, in a well-known campground patrolled by an armed guard, with high fencing and a barbed wire. We decided to reserve judgment until we got to Jerusalem. We asked locals. When pressed about whether we would actually be in danger, most of them just scoffed and said, "Of course not." We even stopped at a local youth hostel once in the area and asked. They assured us it would be fine. We then set up camp, checked in with the security guard, and decided to have an early night. Given that we had made ourselves known, and that no one else except an old man was staying at the campsite, we felt safe. We played Louis C.K.'s stand-up on my iPad while we waited to get tired. At around 11 p.m, I began to hear shuffling outside. It is worth noting that we had the cheapest tent possible, and that the window straps were on the outside. We had velcroed them closed before we went inside. The shuffling continued past the tent, and I assumed someone else had made it to camp late, and was probably setting up. I pressed play again, while my friends teased me for being paranoid. About 10 minutes later, the sound of crushing steps on the ground came back, more deliberate this time. My friends heard it too, and we paused to stand up, all of us poised, still and listening. The crunching stopped as the noise from our tent did, and then started up. It sounded like the guy moved around our tent in a semicircle, then retraced his footsteps. Again, we heard him retreating towards the beach. At this point, we were a tad spooked. Maybe he was lost, maybe he was looking for the bathroom, became our accepted hypothesis, and we went back to watching Louise. Not 5 minutes later, the footsteps came back, louder, far more deliberate. He wanted us to hear him, I guess. We paused to stand up immediately. We were all still for a good minute, and he, outside, was still too. We could hear him breathing. The crazy thing was that we could not see him. We were scared at this point. We hadn't brought weapons with us, but we were confident the guard would hear us if we screamed out. Zed, my bravest and most skeptical friend, called out to him. "Hello? Who is it? What do you want?" We heard his breath catch at us attempting contact, but he said nothing back. We all gasped as we saw his fingers begin to deliberately brush against the side of our tent, grazing Zed. I tried, a despairing and far less assured. "Who are you?" At this point, we were desperate for him to answer, to not be what we thought he was. He didn't reply. Instead, slow and deliberate as his footsteps, he began to unfurl and roll up one of our tent window flaps. It was dark outside, and we could not see his face. I said slowly and quietly to my friends, "On 3, we begin screaming for help, as loud as possible. We don't stop until the guard comes." We began to shriek a terrified cacophony of helps. It was honestly one of the most jarring noises I've ever heard, and it was coming from me. There was something so animalistic about the way we sounded. We were calling for someone, anyone, to help us from this predator. Eventually, far in the distance towards the guard's quarters, we heard someone answer in English. "What? What's happening?" We zipped out of our tent. My friends ran straight towards the men who answered. I ran diagonal from them, picking up rocks and a stick to defend myself with. They turned out to be guards from a local kibbutz filling up their water supply. They had flashlights and a gun. We told them what had happened, and they shone their lights around our tent. Sure enough, in the sand were boot prints in a semicircle all around our tent. The most disturbing were the ones heavy on the toe, when the dude had been essentially leaning with all of his weight forward to see in on us. He had also rolled up another window flap, unknown to us, probably when he was making particularly loud footsteps. Paranoid as I am, I scrutinized the boot prints of these guards with the ones around our tent. They did not remotely match. They followed the footprints, and they led to a set of 3 more boot prints. This guy had been a lookout for 3 dudes, and in the words of the kibbutz guards, we could have been robbed, or worse.
Hey guys, thank you all for watching my video, and if you enjoyed this video, make sure to hit that subscribe button and join the Nightmare Army. I'm always looking for new soldiers in my Nightmare Nation. And as always, I'd like to thank Belladonna Black and the Grim Reaper for joining me on my Collab Tuesdays. And I'm going to start calling this Collab Wednesdays because I keep uploading at around 1 o'clock or 12 o'clock. But anyways, guys, please check out both their channels. I definitely think you guys will like them. They're really awesome horror narrators, and like I said before, I definitely think you guys will enjoy their content. Further news for you guys, my friend Holly Wizzle and I developed this YouTube channel called Purple Horror. For those of you who don't know, Purple Horror is a YouTube channel that spreads awareness of domestic abuse, and I would greatly appreciate it if you guys go and check out the channel. Holly Wizzle's already got a video up on there, so please go check it out and let us know what you think down below. And as always, guys, thank you all for watching, and just remember, the best ideas always come out of nightmares.